All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. You're watching a pre-recorded live stream orchestrated by the First Tuesday Conservatives, hosted by Alpha News Minnesota. Tonight, our guest is Alex Epstein, a climate, how would you describe yourself, Alex? A climate scientist, a climate theorist, a climate policy expert?
Well, I sometimes describe myself as a climate thinker, but I think I'm primarily an energy expert, and then part of energy is climate.
Absolutely. And I see behind you there your book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. I've heard you talk about it in the past, and I've read sections of it, and it seems like you present a very interesting argument. Nowadays, we're usually told that either we protect the climate or we have energy, but you seem to explain how there might be a third position there, another option. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So the overall, by the way, I apologize for my voice. It's pretty wrecked right now, so you might see me sucking on a cough drop. So if you're wondering why I look
Sure.
weird, that's the answer. So, moral case for fossil fuels. The basic theme of the book is that as the world should be using more fossil fuels, not less. As you indicated, the dominant view of fossil fuels is that we need to get off them as quickly as possible to avert climate catastrophe. And what I argue is that fossil fuels actually overall make the world a much better place to live. And interestingly, they make us a lot safer from climate. Most people don't know that in the last 100 years, as supposedly climate change has gotten worse, we're actually 50 times safer from climate than we used to be, which means the
Hmm.
climate death rate, so the number of people who are dying from, or the percentage of people rather who are dying from storms, floods, heat, cold, etc., has gone down by 98%. And the reason isn't because the climate has changed all that much. I think it has changed some, and I think we've contributed to some warming. But the key is really we've become incredibly adaptable to climate. And that is really, really connected to fossil fuels because fossil fuels give us the energy to power the machines that make us so productive and so resilient. So it's actually part of the argument is fossil fuels actually make us safer from climate, and they make a whole lot of other things better as well.
That's a very good point. Humanity is much more apt to adjust to small changes in the environment if we can build houses and then heat them with fossil fuels. That's a really good point.
Right, and there are
So,
billions of people who still can't do it, which is just part of the point I make in the book, is that you can think of it as in the US, we use I like measuring things in like energy and calories. Like we use 2,000 calories a day just to sustain our body. Maybe a manual laborer will work 2,000 calories above that. Our machines, energy is just machine food. They use 200,000 calories. So we have machines doing 100 times more physical work than we can do ourselves. That makes it possible for us to be incredibly productive and incredibly prosperous and have a lot of opportunity. But around the world, there are many people, I mean, billions of people who use less than 1/10 as much energy as we do. So they're living in a manual labor civilization. And when you live in a manual labor civilization, you can barely have a house, and it's not a sturdy house, and it's not a well heated or air conditioned house. In fact, often for heating, people are taking their local animal dung pile or whatever wood they can scrounge around. And they, among other things, they have huge respiratory issues. So it's just really important when we're thinking about global issues, because climate is a global issue. There's a desperate global energy poverty that contributes to desperate global poverty. And if we don't remember that, we're definitely not looking at the big picture.
absolutely. I keep being told that if we burn fossil fuels, our air quality will decrease, our water will stagnate, and the world will be a very messy, dirty place. In contrast to this sort of Green New Deal utopia vision that the left sometimes presents. What are your thoughts on that, and how dangerous or dirty are fossil fuels really?
Well, so in general, our environment has been becoming much cleaner. Part of the mythology of the Green New Deal, but more broadly, the green movement, which is really, you can think of it as it's an anti-human impact movement. It says
Mhm.
that for humans to impact the earth is wrong. It's immoral for us to be impacting the earth so much. And then if we do, it's going to be self-destructive somehow. So what they'll do is they'll take sometimes real side effects or real issues like air pollution, which can definitely be an issue, and they'll use that to define fossil fuels, and they'll act like, oh, fossil fuels have made the world dirtier. Look at this air pollution. But what they ignore, among many other things, is how dirty the world was before fossil fuels. Think about what life is like in a primitive country without modern energy. I mentioned air quality. What do people use when they don't use fossil fuels? They're not using solar and wind because those aren't cost effective at all, mostly because they're not reliable. So they're using wood and animal dung. So even just on an air quality basis, a modern fossil fuel plant, even a coal plant, is way, way cleaner than the natural green energy that billions of people are getting. If you take something like water, though, it's even more pronounced. Nature doesn't give us abundant Evian and Perrier, and then fossil fuels just contaminate it. Nature gives us dirty and distant water that we have to purify and pump. And guess what that takes? That takes machines, and machines need reliable, low cost energy. So if you took like our water quality today and you took anyone from a poor country or from a more natural past, they'd be astounded by our air quality. You think about sanitation is the same kind of issue. And then let alone just how safe we are because of modern medicine, which is using fossil fuel machines all the time. And maybe most importantly, it's only possible because we have fossil fuel machines producing so much food and clothing and shelter for us that we even have time for medicine. In primitive countries, you think they have millions of people dispatched to deal with COVID-19, let alone all the machines those people are using? There's no chance. So
Yeah.
really, like, machine power is so fundamental to our quality of life, but you can only have machine power if you have reliable low cost energy.
Absolutely. I'm very glad that every house in my neighborhood isn't heated by some sort of, animal dung or wood powered stove. It feels like that would be very messy. I'm based in Minnesota. Alpha News is based in Minnesota. One thing that's been a pretty hot topic here is the new oil pipeline, Line 3. And everyone's talking about right now the impact of transporting oil and the impact of mining for oil with fracking. What are your thoughts on oil pipelines and fracking?
Well, so the thing with oil is the most valuable form of energy in the world. It's the most popular form of energy, not popular culturally, but it's
Mhm.
very popular in terms of using it. It's the number one source of energy in the world. So number two is coal, number three is natural gas. And though, by the way, those three combined are more than 4 times every other form of energy combined. So
Mm.
they're just totally dominant in the world of energy. And it's because they provide reliable, low cost energy for billions of people in thousands of places. Oil is particularly remarkable because it's such concentrated energy. It stores a lot of energy in a very small space. And so it's uniquely suited for any kind of mobile application. Anytime you need to move a cargo ship or an airplane, there's a reason why you're always using oil. You're not using batteries. You're not using sails anymore, fortunately. Although I guess you could use sails in the ocean, it just doesn't work very well. So it's oil is we're all using oil all the time, and we also use it for all the different synthetics and plastics that we use, including all the life-saving
Mhm.
ones that are involved in the pandemic right now. So the first thing with oil is this is a vital material that all of us use to incredible benefit all the time. And so then there's a
Mhm.
question of, well, how do you get it? Well, not each of us has our own oil well in our backyard and our own oil refinery to make all these things, nor would we want it. So we need to transport it. And then the question is, what is the safest way of transporting oil? And if you just think about water, what's the safest way of transporting water, which is another liquid? You use pipes, right? You don't put water in a train. You don't put water in a truck. You put bottles
Yeah.
of water, right? But you put it in a pipe because the pipe allows you to transport it cheaply and safely and with minimal chance of leakage and loss. And guess what? It's the
Mhm.
exact same thing for oil. So oil pipeline is the best way to transport oil. So, given that
Mhm.
oil is so important in our lives, in general, we want to encourage oil pipelines. Now, there are issues of property rights that you should pay attention to, but in general, it needs to be this is incredibly good for human life. Now,
Mhm.
fracking, and actually, let me take this opportunity to refer people to a website that can be useful for some of this stuff. I just created a website called energytalkingpoints.com. And if you go to energytalkingpoints.com, you'll see on a lot of different issues just very quick talking points with references. And there's one on fracking. That's why it came to
Mhm.
mind. And what fracking is, I mean, it's short for hydraulic fracturing. It's basically part of the process by which 60%, I think it's 60% of oil and 75% of natural gas in the US is produced. So this isn't some marginal thing. This is
Mhm.
the oil and gas industry in the US totally depends on this. So if we didn't use this, then we would be massively dependent on the Middle East and other places like we were not too long ago. So this is a really important thing. Now, it's because it's an unfamiliar thing, it's been demonized, and people think, oh, it must be dangerous. It's fracking. That sounds scary and stuff. And they claim that it contaminates groundwater, but it is extremely, it is not a high risk activity at all for groundwater. It's much lower risk than many industrial activities, including, by the way, mining for the materials and solar panels and wind turbines. And why is that? It's because things that contaminate groundwater are usually near groundwater, and fracking is a mile below groundwater with lots of solid rock in between the fracking and the groundwater. So this is just a mythology that people have made up to scare people. In reality, fracking, by giving us cheap oil and cheap natural gas, it allows us to have clean water because, as I said before, how do we get clean water? We need low cost energy to pump the water. We need low cost energy to purify the water. So that's oil and gas are helping us make our water clean. They're not some novel threat to the cleanliness of our water.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of the elephant in the room, for me at least, with any conversation about oil is its finality. Eventually, we run out of oil. How long do you predict until that occurs, and what steps could we take to mitigate that eventual deadline?
Well, so if you think, I think most people's model of oil is they think of it like there's a pool full of oil, and maybe we're
Mhm.
halfway through the pool and we're just sucking it with a straw, and then we're going to get to the end and there's going to be nothing to suck, and then we're just going to have all these machines, and then we're not going to be able to put anything in
Yeah.
the machines. And this is a really false model. Uh, though there's more oil in the ground. There's more than 10 times more oil in the ground for sure than we've used in the
Mm.
entire history of civilization. So it's actually a material that we're very early in terms of harnessing, and how much of that amazing amount, we don't really know how much there is, but there's just so much. It all depends on the state of technology. So what you talked about with fracking, you mentioned fracking. The real thing with fracking is fracking has unlocked huge amounts of
Mhm.
oil and natural gas that were previously not accessible in a cost effective way. That is, maybe you could get at the oil, but it would take way too much energy, way too much other resources. Whereas now with fracking and other technologies, we can do it cost effectively. And so that opens up a lot. And so what we see with oil is we're not running out of it, we're running into
Mm.
it. And in my book, in the first chapter, I show these forecasts historically, which say we're about to run out of oil. And yet we can see we used way more oil than they thought was even left in existence. And it's, I think the root cause is people just have a false model of nature as having very limited resources. And if we consume too much, we're inevitably going to run out.
Mhm.
Versus the reality is nature is just an unlimited source of raw matter and energy. And as long as human intelligence is free to function, we'll either keep finding more oil or we'll find better stuff. And in terms of what to do, you don't need to do anything except leave people free, because if people are free to produce and consume, if it starts to become more expensive to produce oil, then guess what? They'll look into alternatives. But and we already do look into alternatives. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to force people today to use an inferior alternative because you're afraid of running out of oil in 200 years. That's just impoverishing yourself. And what it does is it also, by making energy more expensive, it shuts down prosperity, it slows progress, and we'll actually get to that next form of energy more slowly.
Absolutely. So we have an abundance of oil. It's safe to obtain, it's safe to transport. It makes our world better to live in, saves people's lives. Where did this mythology come from then that oil is bad and the green energy is good? What are the roots of this movement that seems to defy logic?
Well, interestingly, there's a new little documentary coming out. It's the Prager University, which I have 5 or 6 videos on, and I
Mhm.
think it's coming out in the next week or so. So people might look out for it. I think it's called Religion of Green, and I'm one of the main people interviewed in it. But I'll give you just a quick uh, encapsulation of what I think is going on. I think it all comes down to this issue of what is the proper relationship between human beings and the rest of nature? And I think there are two basic views you can have on this issue. And so, one, which what I call my own view, is the human flourishing perspective. And this says that we want a relationship with the rest of nature that makes human life as good as possible. So that can be caricatured as, oh, we just want to turn everything into a parking lot and we hate animals and we want to see explode the Grand Canyon. But this is all nonsense, right? Because all of those have a lot of value, but we think of them in terms of we want to impact nature or not, based on what's good for human beings. So certainly sometimes you want to preserve something that's beautiful, but more often than not, you need to dramatically impact nature to make it better. If you don't dramatically impact nature, for example, you can't have accessible clean water because nature doesn't give it to you. If you don't impact nature dramatically, you can't have healthy, plentiful food without it taking your entire life to get. Most people in unempowered places and throughout history, they're spending vast majority of their time just on food acquisition and not very high quality, because if you're not using machines and you're not having much of an impact, then you're just trying to scrounge around for things basically. So it's like, that's my perspective. I would call the human flourishing perspective, and that is the perspective that human beings should have a significant but intelligent impact on the earth. Now, the other perspective, which I think is unfortunately dominant, is the green perspective, but that really means anti-human impact. So it says that it's morally wrong for us to impact the earth. Just like people believe that it's wrong to engage in animal testing, like they think it's wrong even though it benefits human beings, there's a group of people who think it's wrong for us to impact the earth even if it benefits human beings. And I think what people thinking that have done is they've convinced other people that if we impact the earth, it's somehow going to bite us in one way or another. And I call this, they spread what I call the delicate nurturer dogma. So this is the idea that the planet is a delicate nurturer. It exists in this delicate balance, that it's sufficient, it gives us what we need, it's safe, it's stable. But if we impact it, then it's all going to come crashing down. And so this delicate nurturer dogma is just complete pseudoscience. In reality, nature is, you could think of it as wild potential. It's got a lot of potential, but it's if you don't control it, manipulate it, you're in big trouble. But because they promoted this delicate nurturer dogma, they make us think that if we do the wrong thing, if we have a lot of impact, it's going to hurt us. And so with something like oil, they think, oh, oil, we're using it to have so much impact. We're drilling into the ground. We're powering all these machines. It must be bad. And we're trained to only see the bad. And then they throw in something like oil spills and they say, hey, you don't want oil spills, do you? You don't want to make things dirty. But they're not looking at it honestly, because if you looked at it honestly, you'd look at the full context. You wouldn't just look at oil spills like contaminating one body of water. You'd look at oil making billions of people's lives better, including more clean water.
Absolutely. It's kind of a refreshing message to hear somebody be pro-humanity and to tell us that the world isn't going to fall apart. Because I think the left has been very successful in selling this narrative that, we are literally going to end the world. What was it? AOC a couple of years ago said we have 12 years left until everybody
Right.
dies, and people panicked. And it's reassuring to hear that that's actually not the case. One
Yeah,
thing I was wondering.
just one quick
Yeah, yeah.
comment about that is, I think this is a really important point to stress. It's an empirical fact that the world is getting to be a better and better place to live. And just one stat that I like to use. So I was born in 1980. That's not the stat, but it's part of the stat. In 1980, 42% of the world lived in extreme poverty, which means less than $2 a day income. And just think about that for a second. Less than $2
Yeah.
a day income. And now, at least COVID-19 has thrown a wrench in it somewhat, but it's gotten to below 10%. So in 40
Hmm.
years, it's gone from 4 out of 10 people, and this is all adjusted for inflation, $2 a day or less, to 1 out of 10. Like, this is an incredible thing. And if you look at other things I mentioned, like safety from climate is going up, access to clean water, all kinds of infant mortality rates are improving. So, like, the world is becoming a better and better place for human beings to live, and that needs to be acknowledged. And you're right that people act like it's not true. But the reason they're acting like it's not true is because they're not looking at the world from a human perspective. They're looking at it from an anti-impact perspective. So they're saying, well, it's wrong that we've had all this impact. Whereas my view is, well, we've had all this impact and life has gotten a lot better. So why don't we keep making our impact more and more intelligent instead of trying to withdraw and then live in some sort of primitive, non-existent utopia with 8 billion people somehow living off Mother Nature in some natural way. So I think that if we can just be aware that the world is becoming better and better, and then fossil fuel machine power is a big cause of it, it can really help in the argument, because if people, like, one thing I say a lot is, if you don't acknowledge the world is getting better now and how much better it's gotten, then you can't even predict the present. So why would I trust you to predict the future?
Yeah, very good point. When it comes to predicting the future, though, what do you think the trajectory for energy is in these less developed nations that presently don't have the ability to utilize oil and utilize fossil fuels? When do you think they're going to develop that capability? Do you think they're going to develop that capability? And what are the results going to be?
Well, it's important as we talk about how much the world is improving that we're already in the middle of a story where poorer people around the world are using fossil fuels to make their lives better. So if you look at
Mhm.
China, India, I mean, you've had dramatic increases in the use of coal, oil, to some extent, natural gas, although it's not as prevalent. That's not as prevalent in those countries, but so massive use of coal and oil and life expectancies skyrocketing, income skyrocketing. And so what we know is that it's possible. It's really, you could think of a couple factors. One is the decisions of governments there. Like, do they adopt anything resembling a free society with property rights? Because those are the basic conditions that are required for people to create value. If you do have that, we've seen in case after case, if you have any kind of respect for property rights, any kind of pro business, pro freedom laws, then you can be a country where it's profitable for other people to set up, manufacturing facilities. And once you get started with empowering the country, having energy there, having machines there, then you can have a virtuous circle where people are just, they're becoming more productive and they can afford more and they can learn more and then they can become even more productive. That's what you've seen happen. So that depends partially on their governments, but it also depends on our governments not screwing it up. And one really ominous trend of the modern green movement is a very significant opposition to the use of fossil fuels, but also nuclear and hydroelectric energy in poor
Mm.
countries. There's a move toward what they call leapfrogging, which is forcing people to use solar and wind, allegedly because, oh well, we're going to use solar and wind, we say, so why don't you guys just get started right now, right? And then that'll be nice. But the reason we're not using solar and wind, what we're doing is we're using solar and wind as like a luxury parasite on top
Mhm.
of reliable coal and gas and nuclear and hydro. It's like, yeah, we put up solar panels and wind turbines, but those aren't at all self sufficient. They totally depend on continuous, reliable electricity from those reliable sources. They're not the basis, and they make it more expensive because they just add a lot of wasteful infrastructure. The idea that a poor country is going to use just solar and wind is just a complete fantasy, but it's not a fantasy, it's a nightmare. So insofar as organizations like the UN and different countries are encouraging or discouraging people, World Bank is part of this, discouraging people from using fossil fuels and nuclear and hydro, that is really immoral. And unfortunately, a lot of these, like Paris Climate Accords, was partially geared toward this, toward paying people off to not use fossil fuels. Now, you think about what poor governments have in common. One of them is they have a lot of corruption already. That's part of the reason why they're poor. They have bad governments. So you think about what does it do to pay off officials who are already prone to corruption to not adopt fossil fuels? Well, they may be perfectly happy to get their own mansions and whatever the hell they find appealing and keep their country poor. If they might accept that deal, all kinds of dictators will accept that deal. But what we need to be encouraging people to do is adopt more pro-freedom policies, and certainly to industrialize using the lowest cost, most reliable forms of energy they can. And that's invariably going to include fossil fuels.
I completely agree with you there. I mean, we use our fossil fuel dependent society to make solar panels that people can put on their roofs to feel better about themselves. And then for some reason, we expect third world countries to be able to employ that same technology when they're trying to learn how to industrialize. Doesn't make a
Right.
lot of sense to me either. You brought up nuclear energy, and I'm very glad you did because I wanted to ask you about that. What are your thoughts on nuclear energy? I keep hearing from a lot of conservatives that nuclear is going to be the future once it gets deregulated and we need more nuclear energy. And I'm wondering what your opinion is.
Yeah, and I have a few things about this as well on energytalkingpoints.com. There's one section on reducing CO2 emissions, and it has some points
Mhm.
about nuclear. So I think nuclear has enormous potential. What we saw in the 70s was that nuclear, by the way, importantly, it's the safest form of energy ever created. So there's all this mythology that it's dangerous. No, it's actually safer than anything, safer than fossil fuels, safer than hydro, safer than solar, safer than wind. Uh, but so it's we saw that in the 70s, it was able to produce electricity very reliably and relatively cheaply. But what happened is it became very demonized. And part of the demonization was to put so much regulation on it that it's effectively criminalized. And an analogy I use is if you think about, I forgot, what's your name? What's
Kyle.
Kyle? Like if I
Yeah.
think, hey, Kyle, like however much money you make, like if I
Mhm.
forced you, if I said, hey, Kyle, you're only allowed to go around if you have 5 bodyguards all the time. You have to pay a staff of 5 bodyguards. That might be, I don't know, your finances, right? That for me, that would be a big,
That's not
very
realistic.
tough,
I can't
right?
swing that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's unrealistic. So you think about eh, no matter how good a technology is, if you have enough unnecessary regulations on it, you can make it prohibitively expensive. And that's what's
Mhm.
happening with nuclear because it's so demonized. People just keep thinking, oh, let's just add this regulation and this regulation and this regulation. And then guess what? It's super expensive to do. There's a lot of uncertainty. These projects can get shut down. And so people aren't building them. And then often the green movement will say, hey, look, nuclear is so expensive. Yeah, because you made it expensive. I mean, that's like, you break somebody's leg and then a basketball player's leg and say, you're not good at basketball anymore. Yeah, because
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
crippled him. So I'm a big advocate of decriminalizing nuclear. I think that's a very high priority, but
Mhm.
it's important that this is a multi-decade, even multi-generation project. Nuclear is something like 5% of the world's energy. There's it's going to take a while to even get the right policies in place. And then you're talking about generations to scale it up in terms of electricity. And then there's also how does it, provide mobile energy? I think there are ways to do that, but that's not even something we're close to. So it's not that nuclear cannot be. People think of like the Green New Deal, and part of the Green New Deal is let's get rid of all the fossil fuels and replace them with solar and wind, which I call unreliables, in 15 years or whatever it is. So that's one reason that's a terrible idea is because it's using the worst, most unreliable form of energy, solar and wind, which isn't self-sufficient and can't do what they're saying at all. But even with nuclear, like nuclear is not in a position where you could have a Green New Deal with nuclear, where you replaced everything with nuclear in 15 years. But what you can do is you can decriminalize it and you can get that ball rolling.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. We're coming up on the 2020 elections. It's pretty apparent that Trump is the pro fossil fuels candidate. He's done some good things for coal. Recently, he was signaling that he's ready to do some better things for fracking. Very happy with what the administration's accomplished there. But aside from just, Trump is good for fossil fuels, Biden would be bad for fossil fuels, what sorts of policies should our viewers be watching out for? What are the challenges that fossil fuels are going to face, in the upcoming years? And, what pieces of legislation are coming up that could present a problem?
Well, I think the huge thing, and I have trouble talking about this because I have many issues, many
Sure.
disagreements with President Trump. But the thing I agree with him most on happens to be the issue that I specialize in, which is energy.
Yeah.
So in terms of energy, I mean, he's a complete difference in kind from Biden. I mean, what's going on with Biden and more broadly, unfortunately, most modern Democrats is they're calling for the rapid abolition of the US use of fossil fuels. And
Mhm.
this is such a bad idea. It's really almost impossible to communicate how bad this is. The only analogy I can draw is look at what's happened to Venezuela. Of course, everyone's obsessed with socialism. Nobody's interested in the socialist country that's increasingly adopting socialism. What happens? But you see there's a country where it was one of the wealthier Latin American countries, and you've seen in not too long an amount of time, it's just completely declined to the point where it can be hard to get food, hard to get clean water, where people are just living like a very hand to mouth precarious existence. And one feature of that, it's not the only feature, but one feature of that is their energy systems aren't working very well. And
Mm.
that's like everything in our society is like all of our prosperity, all of our security, it just depends on the continuous operation of machines. Like that is just everything is, and it's so easy to take for granted. Sometimes my iPhone ran out of batteries or something, but like everything that supports you is just this continuous machine power doing all this work for you that makes your life easy. That only works if the machines have food, and energy is the machine food. So if you're saying we're going to outlaw fossil fuels, which is 80% of the world's machine food, plus we're against nuclear, plus a lot of the people are even against hydroelectric, and we're going to mandate solar and wind. Just look at
Mm.
California just did a mini Green New Deal, and that's where I live, and we've had significant blackouts. So if you actually followed the policies that Biden and Ocasio-Cortez are talking about, you would that's the fastest way to make America a third world country. Even a fracking ban, which now they're going back and forth on, but like even that would cut off 2/3 of our oil and gas production, just totally change the complexion of the world. So you have, unfortunately, on energy, the dominant thing is there's been so much anti-fossil fuel propaganda and so much pro-solar and wind propaganda that people are literally the highest people are advocating policies that would literally turn America into a third world country. Now, I don't think in practice it's going to fully go that way, but we see in California, you don't even want to go 1/10 that way. So I think that's
Yeah.
the broad thing. That is just this whole Green New Deal, 100% renewable push. That is just a terrible, terrible thing for America.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I really like the way you talk about this. It's very clear, it's very concise, very easy to understand, cuts through all the propaganda. If our viewers want to find more resources like that, of course, you mentioned your book, your website, the documentary, where can they keep up with your work, and where can they find this information?
Yeah, so I mentioned just the easiest thing right now is energytalkingpoints.com. I know this is a political group, so I really encourage you to share this with other active citizens as
Yes,
well as
absolutely.
politicians. It's everything in there is the length of a tweet, and it's all backed up by good references. So just use it however you can. I just want people to use it as much as possible. You don't need to give me credit. Just use those, use those facts. I'm trying to get candidates to use them more and more. And then if they're interested in following me, if you go to my website, industrialprogress.com, I run the organization Center for Industrial Progress. If you just sign up for our email list, then I send out an email every Wednesday with everything that I've been focused on. And then I guess also I'm on Twitter. So twitter.com/Alex Epstein.
Absolutely. Well, Alex, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Thanks so much for lending some clarity to this issue. I feel like it's something that we hear about all the time, but very few people get to actually hear the counterpoints, especially articulated so well. So we really appreciate you coming on the show.
Hey, thanks, Kyle.
Thank you. All right.